Welcome back to my channel, Rotorheads. Today I am flying the 429 under development over the nation's capital. I wanted to talk about flight simulation versus a real helicopter. When I started upgrading my gear, I was surprised how expensive some of this stuff had become. If you go down the rabbit hole of trying to make the experience as realistic as possible, you can spend a substantial amount of money, more money than the average person would think they would be willing to spend. As I mentioned, my experience felt like a 60 to 70% realistic experience compared to a real helicopter. Now, I don't have all the gear. I don't have a motion rig and a collective. But let's say I added that. The motion rig would be the most expensive part. And between the 60 to 70% of the realism, I would take a ballpark estimate and say that the motion rig would put you halfway there to the full experience. So maybe you're at 88 to 85% of the full experience, which is pretty good. But if you tally all that up, a good computer, all the gear, a motion rig, and a virtual reality headset, you're into $13,000 thereabouts, plus or minus. And that's not an insubstantial amount of money. I compared that to the cost of actually getting a pilot's license at my local flight instructor outfit. And they quoted me about $17,000 worth, 70 hours on an R-22. So these are in the same ballpark, not the same amount of money, but the same ballpark. And you question, what are the advantages of staying in a chair in your living room versus just going out to the airfield and getting your license and flying for real? When you're that close to spending the same amount of money, why not just go ahead and do it for real? I think if you're a younger man looking for something to do with your life, that is certainly an opportunity. You could even join the Air Force and get trained for free, and that's worth quite a lot. But for older folks like me who don't have a viable employment future in the aviation arts, the question is it worth it to pay to fly a helicopter versus just doing it at home? Because I have to admit that I have a constant circle of second questionings in my head. Should I do this? Does it make sense to do this? And I really want to do this, but is it worth it? And I sometimes have to sit down and analyze the actual pros and cons of doing so that I can rest assured that my decision is the correct one. So the first thing I want to consider is that flying a real helicopter involves real costs on an incremental basis. If you want to go fly, it's going to cost you $150 an hour. That would be for an R-22, which is kind of the low-end helicopter of flying vehicles. So that alone is $150 an hour. You can just sit in your chair for free. Now, the reason I'm flying in DC today is to illustrate a point. I can do this in Flight Simulator. I can come down and pick up the president and fly him to Andrews Air Force Base in my 429. A very few select pilots can do this in real life. Not even professional pilots with decades of experience can do this. Just a small number of pilots can do this. And in a more generic sense, flying in real life imposes certain restrictions on where you can fly and how you can fly and what you can do. And in Flight Simulator, you can fly anywhere, anything, anytime. And so there's a certain freedom in the simulation that you don't have in real life. One particular curiosity about helicopters in general is that they usually don't have autopilot. And so if you have to take a bathroom break, you can't get out of your seat and go conduct your business in the back. Not that you can do that in a small fixed wing plane either, but in both cases really, if you have to go, how do you manage that? If you're an older person and you've got to go and you really got to go, you may need to wear diapers. In the case of the simulation, you can hit pause, and that's a nice thing. And so that is something that, again, as an older person, I think about. I can go get a glass of my favorite drink, fly for a while, and then hit pause. And I can't do that as an actual helicopter pilot unless I take short flights. So that's a consideration for us older folk. And another aspect that can't be ignored, I've seen a lot of videos and have noticed in the news that there are some unfortunate incidents that result in injury and or death. In a helicopter in particular, these things are very fragile, and it seems like they just hold together barely well enough to stay in the air in one piece. And if there's anything that goes awry in the air, there's little recovery in a helicopter. If you manage to cut your own tail off during a moment of turbulence or unsteady piloting, you're not really going to auto-rotate back to the ground in one piece. Whereas I've had a number of poor maneuvers and landings that I can just respawn and try again. And finally, there's the aspect of treating the reality of the fantasy versus the real. I think there's an aspect of the reality of being a professional helicopter pilot that involves so much more than just flying the vehicle. There's being responsible for the maintenance of the vehicle, making sure that it's flight worthy, that the mission is accomplished, the scheduling, the fatigue of doing a long distance flight, the risk management, the radio communications, and the list just goes on. And there's just so many things involved in actually being a pilot that are not really part of the enjoyable experience of just flying, which is what a flight simulator does. You can involve some of those things in the simulation, but mostly you're just getting in, turning it on, and flying away, and flying and seeing different things. And there's a certain romanticization in that is not accurate to real life. So in a sense, you're really getting the cream of the experience without the rest of it. And there's something to be valued in that. There's the fantasy aspect of it. I can imagine being on a mission without having to spend the 2 hours getting to a rescue site and back. And there's something pleasing about that I don't really have to worry about it. When I get tired, I just stop. And if you rent a helicopter or buy a very small one, you still have to be cognizant of the maintenance schedule and the costs and other aspects that envelop the whole thing and make it a responsibility and an obligation that forces a certain sobriety on the undertaking. Those who treat real flight in a cavalier way, as flight simulators do, usually don't end up flying for very long. So there is this seriousness in real flight that, while you get the advantage of real flight, you also have to treat it much less enjoyably, in my opinion, in the sense that you can't just horse around and do what you like, fly where you want, and get in and get out and you're good. You have to really take it very seriously. There's very little margin for error, and there's a lot of preparation for error. And that makes it less, I don't want to say less enjoyable, but it becomes a much more serious undertaking. And so, as I get to the end of this video, I think I've convinced myself once again that although there are some significant expenses in pursuing the most realistic experience in flight simulation, that it does hold a place. There is a reason that people don't necessarily just go and get a pilot's license. It's not just a cost thing. The cost is there, but the savings are moderate. They're not hugely significant anymore. But it is other elements of it that I think still make flight simulation a viable, useful, and enjoyable hobby. Having said that, as we make our way to the presidential helipad at Andrews Air Force Base, I have no idea if that's the presidential helipad, but let's just assume it is. I thank you for coming and watching, and until next time, may the feeling of that rotor wash over you.